In this lecture, we will implement the create new user function of the user module in the Xiaomi admin application. We will code the new user form that looks like this, allowing the admin to enter the user details such as email, first name, last name, password, and assign one or more roles to the new user and specify the enabled status for the new user. And note that in this lecture, we won't implement the user photos upload as it will be covered in the separate lecture. When the Save button is clicked, the application will save the user details into the database and displays a successful message in the user listing page. If the Cancel button is clicked, it just goes back to the user listing page. And this is how the successful message is displayed after a user has been stored in the database. You see the message is the user has been saved successfully appears just above the table. And the application will filter the list based on the email of the newly created user. But in this lecture, we just implement the code to display the successful message, and the filter and search functionality will be covered in the separate lecture. So in Java code, in the user controller class, we need to implement the new user method that handles the request for creating a new user, and it will invoke the list rows method in the user service class, which in turn calls the file method of the row repository interface, and it will display the rows which can be assigned to the new user in the user form. And when the user form is submitted, the save user method in the user controller class will be invoked, and in turn it will call the save method of the user service class, which in turn invokes the save method of the user repository interface to proceed the user details into the database. Come back to the IDE, and we need to update the user's HTML page here. For adding a hyperlink, create a new user under the heading manage users here. So we use the a tag a create new user, and we use template th href attribute here, and the URL of the link is /users/new, and refresh the user's listing page, and you can see the link create new user appears here. Click on that link and you can see the white label error page because no handler method found for this URL. So in the controller class, user controller here, we need to implement the handler method for this URL user/new. Use the red mapping annotation, and the URL is user/new public string new user. And this handler method returns a logical view name to the user form page. The view name is user_form. So we need to create the corresponding HTML page under the templates directory here. So we can reuse the code of the user's HTML page, copy, paste, and modify. Change the file name to user_form.html. Here, user_form.html. And the title of the page is create new user. And we reuse the code for the header menu, and here the heading of this page is manage user and create new user. And delete the code of the user listing. Okay, save the changes and refresh this link, and you can see the heading of the user form page here, manage users, create new user. Then we need to write some HTML code with Bootstrap CSS style to make the user form that looks like this. Okay, here we create the form section. Form here, wrapping the div section for the form, and the action of the form we also use timediv syntax th::action. Action is slash user slash save, and the method is post, and the first row is for the viewer email. So we use bootstrap div with some styles. For the class is form group row, that we display a form group row containing a label and a field. Label is email, and the class for this label is column small for, and column form label. Number 4 is a number of the column in the grid system defined by bootstrap, and small meaning that the column will be responsive on a small screen. And then the next is the field, and we use the div with the class is column sm8. Sorry, the number 4 is a width of the column, and number 8 is the width of the column. And input type equal email. Email is the new input type available in HTML5. So the browser we provide validation support for email field, and we use the class form control. Okay, and refresh. And you can see the field email appears here. Sorry, the class here we use two classes, form dash group and row, so it will be displayed as a row here. Now you can see email and the text field email here. And to make the form center in the screen, we can set the size for the form here. So here we specify the style for this form is max width is about 700 pixels, and center on the screen we use the attribute margin 0 auto. And you can see the form is now centered on the screen. And for the parent div container of the form here, we can use some classes to make a rounded border and border around secondary and rounded, and with the padding 3. You see we have the rectangle rounded border around the form here. And then at the bottom of the form we should have two buttons, save and cancel. So we have the div section here with the first button, input type equal button, input type equal submit for the save button. The value is save, and user bootstrap class name is btn for button, and btn primary for the green color of the button. And you can see the save button here, and the next button is for the cancel button. The input type equal button, the value is cancel, and the class is btn secondary. We show the button color in gray color. And for the parent div section, we use a class name is text-center to center the buttons on the form. And you see here, and we need to have some extra spaces between these two buttons. So for the submit button, we can use a class margin which size is 3, and you can see here. And to map the value of the form field to a user object in the model, we need to update the controller in the handler method new user here. Create a new user object and put this user object onto the model. So Spring MVC and Timeleap, we buy this user object onto the form here. We need to have reference to the Spring MVC model object here, and we need to put the add attribute, and name is user and value is a user object here. Okay, and in the user form we need to use the attribute for the form tag here. For the form tag here, we need to use gh object, and then the name of the object on the model is user here. And then we can map the field email with the property in the entity class user email here. So here in the input type equal email, we use gh:field and refer to the property name of the entity object, which is email here. And for the validation of this email, we need to use the require attribute, and the minimum length for this email is minimum length. Min length is about 7 characters, and the maximum length, max length, is about 128 as per the data requirement for email. Okay, save the changes and refresh the user new form here. Now click the save button. You can see the built-in validation error message of Chrome browser here. Please fill out this field if we leave the field empty. Now I enter something that is not email, and you can see is a validation error message immediately appears here, indicating that this field is email. Okay, this email is valid because there can be email like this, you see. And when clicking the save button here, we got a white label error page because the URL user/save is not handled by any handler method. So in the user controller class here, we need to implement the handler method for the form submission, and we need to use the post mapping annotation for handling HTTP post request, and the URL is user/save because the action of the form is user/save here. Public string save user, and to map the values of the form fields to a user object or user object on the model here, in Spring MVC we just declare user object as the method parameter here. Very simple. And here I just return redirect to the user list based as this URL/users, and for testing purpose just print out the details of the user object here. In the user object we already implement override the toString method, so it will print the details of the user. Okay, save the changes, and we now can test the submission of the form. Okay, and click the save button here. directs to the user's listing page and in the console. Let's see what is printed in the console. User controller. Nothing printed. Alright, here it prints user details. Here you can see user ID, no email here, email name at localhost here. Okay. Then update the user form for the other fields, first name, last name, and password. So we can copy, paste, and modify this deep section for a form field here, and this is for the first name field. Label is first name, and the input type is text, and the mapping field name is first name, with the minimum length is 2 characters, maximum length is 45 characters. So create new user, and you can see the first name field appears here, and similarly for the last name field, the label is last name, and the field property name is last name. Minimum length and maximum length are the same. And the next field is for password. The label is password, and the input type is password, with the mapping property name is password, and minimum length is 8 characters, and maximum length is about 20 characters. Refresh, and let me enter some values. Name at code java.net, first name name, last name Minh, password name 2020, and click the save button. You can see the validation error message for the length of the password. So here I need to input password with minimum length is at least 8 characters. Click save, and in the console view, let's see what is printed. We got only email. First name is no, last name is no. I think we need to refresh the create new user form. Let me check the code here. Email name at code java.net, first name name, last name Minh, and password. Click save. You can see in the console view it prints email, first name, last name. Here the password is not printed. Next, we need to show a list of rows on the form here that allows the admin to assign one or more rows to the new user. So we need to update the user service class here to implement a method that will return a list of row objects from the database. Public list row, and the method name is list rows, and it will invoke the file or method of the row repository. So we need to have a reference to row repository interface here, row repo. So we need to change the user repository variable here to user repo here, and here we simply return row repo file here, and cast the return object to list row here, and then in the controller handler method new user here we need to retrieve a list of row objects and put it onto the model here. Service list rows here, and put this list rows onto the model so it will be available in the user form. Okay, save the changes, and then in the user form here we need to add another section for the rows after the password field here, so we can copy, paste and modify the div section here. The label is rows here. We need to have a colon right after the label. Okay, and here we use th block from timediff, and we use th h here to iterate through each element in the collection with the variable name is row in the list rows, and for each row here we create a input type checkbox, input type checkbox with the name is rows. We don't need to use the name, we just use a th field and map to the rows attribute rows property in the entity class user here. You see rows here, which is a set collection, and then we print the text for the checkbox th text equals the value of the variable row dot name, and then the value for this input checkbox is row dot id. Okay, and refresh the new user form, create new user. We got an error, null pointer exception, cannot invoke com.sort.me.admin, this row repo is no. Sorry, in the business class user service we need to use the auto-while annotation here. So Spring Framework we generate and inject an implementation of the row repository interface at runtime. Okay, and refresh, and you can see the row names get displayed here: admin, salesperson, editor, shipper, assistant. So far so good, right? You can right click and view page source to see the generated HTML code, and you can see we have the name rows for each input type checkbox here, because when we use the th field timediff here, it will generate the field name based on the property name rows here, and we need to add the row description next to the row name in small text, and we print the value of row dot description, and for each input we need to have break line here. Okay, and refresh, and you can see the row names appear and the description next to each row here, and we need to add some spaces. So in the input checkbox here we can use the class margin which size is 2 here, and refresh, and it looks perfect now, right? Try to enter some values, click the save button, and you can see the form validation here. And I select two rows, row salesperson and row editor, and click save. And in the console view, let's see what is printed. And you can see it prints here user, email, first name, last name, and roles, salesperson, editor here. Perfect, right? So when using Timeleaf with Spring MVC, it is very easy to map the values on form field on the form with the model object. And the next field on the form is for the enabled status of the new user. And note that we won't implement the user photos upload in this lecture. Okay, and the next field on this form is for the enabled status here. The label is enabled, and here we just use the input type equal checkbox and th field that maps to the field enabled of the user entity class, and refresh the new user form, and you can see the enabled checkbox here. And by default we want that the new user is enabled, so in the controller class in the user object here we set the enabled status here to true. Okay, save the changes and test the form again. Refresh, and you can see the enabled status is true by default here. Then we need to update the handler method for the form submission here in the controller class here. Save user method here. Here we just simply call the method save of the service class service.save user object, and we create this method in the user service class. And here we just delegate the code to the user repo save user here. Okay, save the changes and we are ready to test creating a new user. Refresh the user new form, create new user here, and enter the email is Dennis Marken 23@gmail.com. First name Dennis and last name is Marken, and password is Dennis 2020, and I assign the roles editor and assistant for this user, and click save. And you can see the newly created user appears in the list here. Email Dennis Marken here, Dennis Marken, editor assistant here. Perfect, right? Let me verify by checking the database in MySQL Workbench here. You can see before that we have just 2 users here, and now execute this SQL select statement. You can see the new user Dennis Marken appears here. And lastly, in this lecture, we need to display the successful message after a user has been stored in the database here, just above the table. Okay, so in the handler method, in the controller here, we need to have a reference to the redirect attribute here, redirect attributes here, because after positioning the user object into the database, we return a redirect view. So we need to use redirect attributes here to add a attribute which is then available in the user list page. So here we use redirect attributes, add flash attribute, and the attribute name is message, and the message is the user has been saved successfully. Okay, save the changes, and in the user listing page we need to add a div section to display the successful message just right above the table here. So we need to have a new div section here, and this div section is display only when the message variable is available. So we need to use the th colon if here, if the message is not null here, then we display the message here. Message is the value variable in the model, and we use some bootstrap classes here. Class alert success, and center the text here. Okay, now we are ready to test creating another new user. Click create new user and enter the email for new user is anna.maria@gmail.com. First name is Anna, last name is Maria, and password Maria 2020. And for this user, we want to assign the role salesperson and editor for this user, and click the save button. And you can see the successful message appears just right above the table here. The user has been saved successfully. Perfect, right? And you can see the new user Anna Maria gets display at the end of the list here. And let me check in the database. Execute SQL select statement, and you can see new row with ID 5 got inserted here for the user Anna Maria. And the user Anna Maria has a role salesperson and editor here. Perfect, right? And finally, we are going to implement the code for the cancel button here. When it is clicked, it just goes back to the user listing page. So come back to the project here, and in the user form here, we can use a jQuery to handle the click event of this cancel button, and we assign an ID for this button cancel. And here we add a script section for JavaScript here, and we use jQuery document ready on the ready function. On the ready event of the document, we execute this function. And here we just use the query selector to select the button cancel. And on the click event of this button, we execute a function here. And in this function, we just set the location of the window location to the URL of the user listing module. So here we can use the time-lift syntax for the URL of the user's listing user module here. We put the code before the closing body tag here. Okay, save the changes, and let's test the cancel button. Create new user here. We got an error because of this. We need to use the @ here. Refresh. Okay, and view page source, and you can see the JavaScript code, the query here. Open the developer console here to make sure that no errors, no JavaScript errors. Developer tools here, and you can see in the console tab here, no errors, and you can see our user form is also responsive on the mobile screen here. Perfect, right? Okay, and click cancel button. You can see it goes back to the user listing page. That exactly what we expect. That's awesome, right? So far we have done coding the create new user functionality of the user module in the Xiaomi admin application. And please note that we will implement the user photos upload in a separate lecture.